All right, Lamont and Tara, you want to introduce yourselves?
Sure. Good afternoon.
Yeah.
My name is Lamont Edwards, and I'm a staff attorney at Senior Law Center, where I've been a staff attorney for about 2 years. Before coming to Senior Law Center, I practiced private criminal defense for several years, and also worked at the Philadelphia Defenders Association as a public defender.
Good afternoon. My name is Tara Saunders. I am the Philadelphia Outreach Coordinator and Domestic Violence Specialist with Senior Law Center. I've been with Senior Law Center for 6 years. I've been working with victims of domestic violence for a total of about 17 years. I got my start working at Women Against Abuse as their criminal paralegal. I've also worked in shelter services. I've worked with victims of domestic violence at People's Emergency Center.
So the voice you might hear but not see on the screen, my name is Leah Finlayson. I'm the Director of Victim Services. Lamont and Tara are the main presenters here, and we're so happy to be with you today to share some of our experiences about working with elder victims of crime, right? So the title is the who, what, when, where, and how when working with elder victims of crime. So I'm going to start by just telling you a little bit about Senior Law Center for those of you who don't know. Many of you hopefully do. Our office is in Philadelphia, but we also expanded recently in the last 5 years to Bucks, Chester, Delaware, and Montgomery counties with the generous support of the Victim of Crime Act funding. Those additional offices can handle cases of elder abuse and financial exploitation. So not only can we handle the PFA cases, the financial exploitation cases, but we can also handle anything that is ancillary and related. So for instance, if a landlord is being abused by a tenant, we can also assist with a landlord-tenant eviction action. If a family member or some other person is being emotionally abusive and someone doesn't qualify for a PFA, we can file what's called an ejectment action to get them out of the house. If the perpetrator steals the senior's money and because of that, or a credit card, and because of that they're being sued for a credit card debt, we could defend that credit card debt. So I know many of your organizations also have similar funding, so we're happy to be able to represent in many of those cases for our seniors. Again, Senior Law Center is the largest nonprofit devoted to representing seniors 60 and older. We handle about 5,000 seniors a year. We do a combination of direct individual representation, legal advice and referrals, community education, professional trainings, and advocacy. So we're often testifying before City Council and working with many of our partners, both statewide, local, in trying to do changes in the law that will help our senior clients, right? So the biggest thing when I go to presentations, the biggest thing we say is all our services are free. So I'm happy to certainly say that. And again, we've been in existence for over 4 years. We also do a helpline, senior helpline. So in Pennsylvania, in any county, in 67 counties, if you have any type of legal problem, you can contact us and we can give you some legal advice or assistance. But as I said, in Philadelphia and the surrounding counties, we can represent you in court or do some other additional services for victims of crime. So I'll turn it back to Tara and Lamont. So Tara?
All right, so one of the first things we wanted to do is just do a true and false quiz just to get a gauge of where everybody is with domestic violence. So some of the questions we have on here: domestic violence only occurs between intimate partners, such as spouses, girlfriends, or boyfriends.
So let me interrupt you for a second for the audience. Please feel free to put your answers in the chat. If at any time during the presentation you have a question, we want to try to make this as interactive as possible, even though we can't necessarily see you, but please put any questions you have in the chat and any answers to these questions in the chat. Okay.
Thanks, Leah. So the second question: senior citizens generally have difficulty communicating and usually need the help of family members or friends when seeking services. Most elder abuse is the result of caregivers becoming overwhelmed with stresses of caretaking. And that question kind of stands out, or that question does stand out a little bit because normally it's the opposite. Normally the family member is, either physically abusing the senior or they are financially abusing the senior, taking their ATM cards or stealing money out their wallets. Number 4, a senior citizen who has been abused by an intimate partner early in life ceases being victims of intimate partner violence in his or her later years. Elderly men are rarely the victims of domestic violence. Elderly women are rarely the victims of sexual assault.
So I'm not sure if anyone else has been able to put any answers in the chat. Lamont or Tara, if you could look and see. If not, certainly, many of you have domestic violence backgrounds, so some of you know the answers are pretty easily, right? So domestic violence only occurs between intimate partners. What have we seen, Tara, right? What have we seen about what's common about who the abusers are?
Yes, so a lot of times, especially with the men, a lot of times if they are sickly men, they normally are being abused by either their home health aides or people that they brought into the house to maybe assist them with cleaning their homes. They end up starting relationships with these people, and they will bring in other family members. They'll bring in their family members into the household, and so not only is the senior being abused by this additional person, but also their family members.
Right, so that's false. So number 2, is that true or false about senior citizens and communicating?
Let me see some of the answers. We have some.
So we see that generally is false, right, Lamont? So what do we want to say to the courts, right? That seniors can communicate and they can tell their story.
That's right.
There's many common myths that seniors aren't good witnesses. That's actually not true. We've had citizens, clients who are 90 years old and sharp as a whip and can remember,
Right.
Probably have better memory than I can. And then other clients may need a little bit of help, but generally speaking, seniors can communicate and tell their story. All right, Tara, you want to go over number 3?
Okay. Most elder abuse is the result of caregivers becoming overwhelmed with the stresses of caretaking. So I do have some answers in here. I think somebody said it was true. Let me just read that again. Most elder abuse is the result of caregivers becoming overwhelmed with the stresses of. So I have down here false.
Yeah, so that's a tricky one. So that was, the research is essentially that was sort of a theory that people were putting forth, that it's because of their stress, so that why people are being abused. But that sort of puts aside many of the issues that we're seeing, right? So it's drug addiction. It's the abuser who is the one financially exploiting the senior. It's a lot of other things, and it sort of puts the blame necessarily on the senior. And so that's why many advocates, including Senior Law Center, is trying to dispel that myth, right? Number 4.
A senior citizen who has been abused by an intimate partner early in life ceases being victims of intimate partner violence in his or her later years. So I have some answers in the chat. Some people said true. Some people said false. You know what? I didn't circle the answer. Leah, did you want to answer that?
Sure. So, right. So what we're sort of saying is, unfortunately, the abuse cycle usually continues even into the later years. So that is false, right? So, we have, right, 90-year-old clients, 95-year-old clients who are still being abused, and probably it started back when they're in their 20s and 30s, and oftentimes they just don't report because that's what they've sort of always gotten used to, unfortunately, right? Number 5.
Elderly men are rarely the victims of domestic violence. So we have some falses in here, and that answer is actually false. Within my 6 years of being at Senior Law Center, I'm seeing more and more men become victims of domestic violence, whether it's against, whether they're being abused by an intimate partner or it might be a family member.
or a caretaker.
And the last one about elderly women and sexual assault.
Yeah, elderly women are rarely the victims of sexual assault. So that too, I have false. I have some people in here that say false. And again, I'm going to say within the last 2-3 years, the numbers have increased with senior loss, and I'm starting to see more and more women state that they are victims of sexual assault, whether it's by an intimate partner or people who live in their senior apartments. So we are seeing more and more cases like that.
I mean, as we all know, elder abuse is underreported, but sexual assault by elderly women is the most underreported form of abuse.
So now I want to talk to you a little bit about elder abuse and elders in America. When you talk about seniors and poverty, there's 1 in 10 seniors are living in poverty in America. Now, this is higher for women than it is for men. Hispanic seniors are 3 times as likely to live in poverty, and African-American seniors are 2.5 times more likely. And by the year 2030, it's estimated that there will be about 72 million seniors living in poverty. When you look at homelessness and how it affects seniors, between the years 2013 and 2020, this was increased 33%, and is projected to increase another 100% by the year 2050. Now, here is a sampling when you talk about Philadelphia. Now, the average rent in Philadelphia is $1,700 a month. Now, Kensington is a neighborhood which is seen as more affordable in Philadelphia, but even in Kensington, they rent apartments 1 bedroom for $850 a month. Now, for a senior who is on a fixed income, you can see how this can be a challenge, and why it would certainly increase or go to increasing seniors living in poverty and homelessness. And then when you talk about food insecurity, now in 2013, there were 2.9 million families who had a senior that were experiencing food insecurity. And this is projected to increase by 50%. And for those seniors who are in retirement age or ready to retire, nearly 1 in 5 have no retirement savings at all. Now, Tara's going to talk to you a little bit about the Pennsylvania senior demographics.
Okay. So with the Pennsylvania senior demographics, there are 2.8 million seniors in 67 counties, 4th largest percentage in the United States. 1 in 4 Pennsylvanians are seniors today. 24.2% of all Pennsylvania households include 1 or more seniors. The population age is 85 plus, expected to increase over the next 20 years in total number percentage. Growing groups of linguistic and cultural minority elders. Next slide.
So now we look at what is really an ongoing crisis in America, and that is elder abuse. It is pervasive. 1 in every 10 seniors are affected by some form of elder abuse. Now, elder abuse is estimated to affect nearly 5 million seniors a year. Those who suffer with elder abuse, those victims are 3 times more likely to die prematurely. It's devastating. The financial exploitation will cost seniors and their families at least $2.9 billion. And for those seniors who are affected by violent injuries, that cost is going to be $5.3 billion. And Tara's going to talk about who the victims are.
Who are the victims? Women and men can be abused. I'll say that again. Women and men can be abused. Most elder abuse occurs in the community. There's a small percentage of abuse occurs in nursing homes and other institutional settings. Most older adults are able to speak for themselves. Next slide, Leah.
Now, the National Clearinghouse for Abuse in Later Life, which is known as NCALL, defines abuse in later life as the willful abuse, neglect, abandonment, or financial exploitation of older adults, those who are 50 years and older, by someone who is in an ongoing trust-based relationship with them. Those persons can be their spouse, their partner, a family member, or their caregiver. Next slide, please.
All right, so many of you who've worked with victims of domestic violence have seen the power of control wheel, right? So there was a power control wheel for elders that are done. A lot of the same types of dynamics that are in the younger abuse wheel is also in the senior abuse wheel. Some of the things that generally that the abusers target, which is different for seniors, is dependency, right? So oftentimes it is a caregiver or a household member that helps out with the senior. So they say, I'm not going to take you to the doctor unless you do X, Y, and Z for me. You give me some money, you do this, you pay this bill for me. I'm going to take away your walker or your wheelchair if you don't do what I want to do, right? They try to tell them, right? You can report it, but no one's ever going to believe you, right? If the senior has some type of diagnosis of dementia or even Alzheimer's, that doesn't mean they can't credibly report abuse, but the abuser, perpetrator, often takes advantage of that. So those are some things that are somewhat unique about, the senior victim of domestic violence than others. So sort of what's related to that, right? So we sort of talk about challenges, again, about what younger victims see and why they don't leave their abusive situation or why they don't report. Again, I'm not going to read the slide because you can also see some of the issues. For the older victims, right, it's those things plus, right? So older victims are usually less likely to seek help from outsiders. They, again, have a fear of alienating or losing their caregiver. Many of their children discourage them from taking action, right? The adult children say, well, you can't report, your spouse for this. I don't want anyone to know. Often the abusers will say, if you report, I'm going to put you in a nursing home, right? So these are some of the dynamics that the seniors are dealing with and often why they don't report. Some things we often don't think about, right? Shelters. So we talk to seniors about going to shelters and they often say to me, I'm never going to go to a shelter. I don't see anyone else like me and it's not accessible, right? So I'm in a wheelchair, but the shelter isn't good for me. Or, I can't just leave my abuser because my house is already retrofitted for me, right? It has the grab bars, it has a ramp, it has other things that I need. And just the idea of, when Tara is safety planning, you have to safety plan differently for a younger victim than an older victim, right? So many of our clients have health problems and they can't physically run to safety, right? So when the abuser is acting up, they can't actually run to safety because they use a walker, they use a cane, they use a wheelchair. And so those are certainly things that, we think about when we're trying to safety plan with an older victim. Darren?
All right. So how many people have seen this image before, the iceberg? You can put your answers in the chat if you would like. I like to use the iceberg image because when a client first comes in, especially dealing with seniors, they're telling you the direct issue. And for our case, it's just the legal issue. But once you start speaking to the client, you realize that they have other issues. There might be mental health. There might be drug and alcohol. They might have issues with, paying their bills. They might need food. So they might need food resources. So although the initial, that you only see the top of the iceberg, which is when the client comes in, that I have a legal matter, but then they have all this underlying issues, which I just mentioned. And that's why I like to include this in the slide. And just in case you can't see, it states that for every one case of elder abuse that comes to the attention of the responsible entity, another 43 cases never come to light. Next slide, Leah. All right, so let's meet Mr. Jones. When getting information or putting together this presentation, I purposely wanted to use a male victim because, again, we don't always, you would think, males are not victims of domestic violence. So I'm just going to give you a little background of Mr. Jones. So he's 66 years old. He's African-American. He has 2 sons, and he's a retired mental health worker. But unfortunately, Mr. Jones was being physically and mentally abused by his son, Andrew, and we'll call him AJ. Now, on January the 1st, 2020, Mr. Jones had to call the police on his son because they got into a verbal altercation that became physical. While contacting the police, Mr. Jones also tried to have his son 302 involuntarily committed because of his son's behavior. When the cops arrived, AJ was so erratic that Mr. Jones was afraid to allow the police to go upstairs in his son's room. Because of everything that's going on in the country, he just did not want his son to get killed by the police. Next slide. So now we're going to give you a little background on Andrew AJ Jones Jr. He's a 36-year-old African-American male. He's the youngest son to Mr. Jones, and he's been in and out of the Philadelphia prison system since he was a teenager. He was also diagnosed with bipolar and schizophrenia. Mr. Jones recently had tried to get him 302, which is involuntarily committed. Next slide. Okay. So when Mr. Jones entered the office, these were some of the questions that I asked, and it's very important to ask these questions when you're speaking with older adults. You want to ask, who is the abuser? You want to make sure that you get the correct spelling of all parties involved so we can do a conflict check. You want to know, when did the incident occur? I try not to re-traumatize the clients, but a lot of this information we do need. Where did the incident occur? What happened? Were the police called? And if they were called, were you able to get a district control number? In Philly, we call it a DC number, but the district control number, that's where that's the number that's used to file the police report. So you can always reference that, and you can get more of a detailed report with that number. Did you have to go to the hospital or receive medical treatment? If so, what hospital? Do you have discharge paperwork? And did you talk to the social worker at the hospital to let them know what's been going on? Next slide. Do you have photos of your injuries? If seniors have pictures, I'll often ask them to email them to me. And also if they come to court and I meet with them, I also will take pictures with the client's permission. I ask, was this an isolated incident, or did this happen in the past? Does the abuser have mental health issues? Does the abuser use drugs or alcohol? And I also try to find out if they do use drugs. I try to get a description of the drug. If they've seen it, I also ask for the behavior patterns. Right now in Philly, there's an influx of people using heroin and K2 and wet, and so they all have different behavior patterns, and I always like to ask those questions so I can paint that picture for the attorney for when they have to speak with the senior. Did you file for a PFA? Have you ever had one in the past? A lot of times the clients, they would have filed in the past, but they didn't move forward because the abuser changed and they wanted to give them another chance. Is the abuser your primary caregiver? Do they administer your medication or prepare your meals? Do they have access to your money or your bank accounts? A lot of times, with family members, they'll give, their PIN number to, their caregiver who also happens to be an abuser. A lot of times they'll say, hey, you can go out and take $30 out to get food. And then by the time I talk to them, they say they took thousands of dollars out of my bank account. You can also ask, have they stolen any money from you in the past? And I also ask not only money, but have they stolen your medication? Next slide. So here are some of the concerns that Mr. Jones had with local law enforcement. Again, he was afraid that his son might get killed by the police because of the history of Black people being murdered while in police custody. He was very adamant with Lamont and I during our meetings with him. Like, I did not want the police they could have knocked me down, they could have did anything. I was not going to let them get to my son. I did not want my son to be a statistic. The times that Mr. Jones did call the police on AJ, sometimes they did not show up because they're like, oh, that's just the same house. We've been there before. It's a domestic dispute. They'll get over it. And he felt like nothing was done to ever de-escalate the situation. Lastly, when Mr. Jones asked for assistance with the service of the PFA, so Mr. Jones, he went to the police district to have them serve his son. And they gave him such a hard way to go that when his son was actually brought into the district, Mr. Jones just handed the paperwork over to his son. And, that was considered, service in his sight, because he was just like, the police, they're giving me such a hard way to go. I just want to get this over with. Next slide.
So for those who don't practice in Philadelphia, unfortunately, the system is, and we noted this in another slide, that petitioners and PFAs are responsible for service of the protection order. So obviously, they're not supposed to do it themselves, even though Mr. Jones had to at this point. They're supposed to really direct it to go to the local police station. In Philadelphia, if you go to a local police station, they may ask you to wait around for 2 or 3 or 4 hours while they're trying to. That is a terrible system we have. During the pandemic, the sheriffs were assisting, and they may still be assisting a bit, but they're not reliable. And so that's why, because it's often an emergency situation, seniors are going to the police station to try to get service. And, like Mr. Jones, we're often seeing problems with the police. They're not filling out the affidavits correctly. They're not handing the affidavits to the seniors. And then it takes a while for us to try to track down where the affidavit is.
Okay, so here are some of the safety plan tips that I use. So when I safety plan with a senior, I ask them, do you need your locks changed? If so, we can refer them to our or another organization that we work with, which is CARI, Center for Advocacy and the Rights and Interests of the Elderly. And there's a slide on that with that information. Does the senior have a working telephone? A lot of times the seniors, they don't have, phones. They're borrowing phones from their neighbors or their loved ones. Does the senior need help filing for a protection from abuse order? So part of my job is to go to the Philadelphia Family Court Domestic Violence Unit. Before COVID, it was 3 days a week, but since COVID, it's 1 day a week, and I'm there for 3 hours. And so when a senior comes to file for a PFA, once they're identified, the DVU staff, domestic violence staff, they will bring that client to me. I will explain the filing process to them, and then I will complete an intake with them and get them scheduled to speak with an attorney. And so part of the filing process is they'll meet with the interviewer, who will ask them about the current abuse, and they'll ask them about the past abuse. After they're done with the interview, they'll have to go downstairs and speak with the judge for the ex parte hearing, and just to answer some follow-up questions that they that they answered in the interview. Once they're done speaking with the judge, they have to come upstairs and wait for their paperwork. Sometimes that paperwork can take between 2 and 3 hours to get. I also find out what police district that they live in, and I email the victim assistance officer. So in Philadelphia, in every police district, there's a victim assistance officer who works specifically with the victims of crime. And so I safety plan with the client's permission with the victim assistance officer and themselves, and I ask them, can a well check be completed so the officer can go out and speak to the client and just make sure everything's okay? And I asked if they can be on roll call, so that's when the police officers will kind of like circle the area of where the incident occurred or where the senior lives, just to make sure that the abuser or the defendant in the case is not trying to enter the home. I kind of touched on that. And after I do that, I do copy and paste all the information that I sent, whether to the victim assistance officer or to any supportive agencies, into our database. Again, when I'm doing intake, I like to paint a picture for the attorney, so it's an easy transition from myself to the attorney. Next slide. Okay. Also, if a senior is open to speak with a counselor or a therapist or a sponsor, I will suggest that I normally will refer them to CARI, and they have a counselor on site. And if that's not a good fit, either that counselor will find another therapist for them, or I'll even look for additional services. If the abuser was arrested, I will assist the client with getting connected with the victim assistance coordinator with the district attorney's office, just so they can get information about their case prior to the hearing. At Senior Law Center, we have what is called a legal health checklist. And through that checklist, we review all the seniors' potential legal and other social service needs. And that kind of goes back to the iceberg image. Again, they came in for the legal issue, but there's so many different layers that they might have even forgot that they had. And so if I can get those resources to them, I will get it. And if not, as advocates, we will find a way to get resources. Okay.
One of the biggest things, one of the biggest things I refer to, Tara, is often housing resources, right? So our seniors, if they may not be able to stay in the place that they're in, maybe they don't own their house, and so trying to find appropriate housing for any of our clients is really an issue that's a big challenge for us.
Yes, big challenge. Also, I work with the seniors to obtain copies of their lease or hospital records, any supporting documents that will help the case and that will make it easier for the attorney. I try to have all of that information. And then lastly, I schedule the call with the first available attorney or emergency attorney. And that's where we'll kind of transition over to Lamont, where he'll discuss his part.
Well, thank you, Tara. And what Tara has done, she has really laid the groundwork. So when the call is scheduled for me or the case is assigned to me, I then set out my action plan and what I'm going to do. And the first step is I'm going over the demographics with the seniors. I'm going to get the correct spelling of that first name, last name, or to ensure the correct spelling of that name. Even if their name is Bob Jones, as silly as it may be, I'm going to go over it because sometimes in the system, when there's, court dockets or what have you, there could be an end on the E of Bob or what have you. So you want to ensure that their name is spelled correctly. I'm asking them for phone number, cell number, landline, correct number, what number is safe to leave a message for you that only you can receive that message, because there are times if the adverse party is not still in the home, they may still have keys and can access the home. When I ask for the address, I'm ensuring that the address is laid out correctly, and then I will ask the senior, is this a safe address where we can send mail about your case that only you can receive? Because we don't want the adverse party getting the senior's mail that is referring to them about their case. So we try best we can to avoid that. When you talk about conflicts, again, we go back through conflicts, making sure that the adverse party's name is spelled correctly. We want to make sure that we're not in any current litigation with the adverse party or previous litigation. If there has been, we then want to do the steps necessary to avoid that conflict. If it's an organization, we want to run the name of that organization. We've come across organizations that a lot of seniors have called up and they've had problems about. So that raises a red flag that there's something going on with that organization. So you always want to check organizations as well. I'll go to PA Unified Judicial System, and that is UJS that we call it for short. Now, we will check the adverse party for open criminal matters that are related to this PFA action or this domestic violence action. And what you do, you go into that system, it is last name first, and then their first name last, and the county. Also, you want to run and check aliases. Now, if they're known in the neighborhood as Boo Boo the Fool, and they told the cops, well, I'm Boo Boo the Fool, once the police assign that alias to you, that alias, just like the police identification number, follows that adverse party defendant through the rest of the court litigation. So you may have court documents under Boo Boo the Fool. So you have to check name and aliases. Now, once you do that, you want to let the court know if there is a action arising out of that criminal or that domestic violence situation. Now that could be like aggravated assault, simple assault, reckless endangerment of another person, or PIC. Those are normally the charges that come out of a domestic violence situation. Now let's say we have a situation where our client was assaulted and then 2 days later, the adverse party robs a 7-Eleven. Well, they have a charge for robbery, but that is not relevant to our case. And the reason we want to make sure that there are no open, or if there are open criminal matters related to our case, that the judge is aware of them, because they do have a right against self-incrimination. Our proceeding is civil. So you don't want them to say anything in the civil hearing that can be used against them in criminal. And then we'll check the protection from abuse database. We call it PFAD. So we're checking both our clients as well as the adverse party for any past or present PFA orders. Next slide, please. So when I come to the case note, the first thing that I do, I read through the case notes, and then I'm writing down any questions that I have confusion about or something that I want the senior to expound upon just a little bit more so I can flesh it out. Also, I take note of any details or instructions that the advocate may put in the notes. There are a lot of times when Tara, I'm reading her notes, she will say, be sure to follow up with this or ask the senior about that because they didn't have a chance to fully develop it because someone was coming in or out of the room and the senior did not feel comfortable saying that information. Now, before the senior tells their story, the one thing that I do is I always thank the story. Now, you heard Tara talk earlier about we try our best not to re-traumatize the senior. So I always want to thank them to begin trying to build a rapport with them. I always let them know that everything that they say to us is confidential. That starts the trust. We presume capacity. We always, before the pandemic, we would interview in our offices, door closed, that we have that confidentiality, the seniors are feeling comfortable. It's been a little bit more challenging over the phone, but we want to ensure that the seniors are talking to us on a time that they select that is good for them, where they feel comfortable to open up and tell us their story. We accommodate for sensory changes. Are they hard of hearing? Do they have vision impairment? We certainly want to accommodate for cognitive changes, and that is selecting the time of day. Now there is the sundowning effect, and that deals with the disruption of the circadian rhythms, your natural body clock. So this tends to happen late in the afternoon into the evening. It tends to disrupt behavior. So a senior could become more confused, more aggressive, and they have a hard time following instruction. So you want to keep that in mind as you set the time when you're speaking to your senior. And if English is not their first language, we certainly access tools like Language Line with an interpreter so that the senior can understand us clearly and that we can understand them clearly, because the details do matter. Next slide, please. So now when you're looking at these questions, these are the questions that I usually ask the seniors, because this is what the information that the judge wants to know. And this comes right out of the statute 6102 that deals with domestic violence. And we want to make sure that they are hitting all of those elements. So these first 5 questions really go to the who. What's your address? Do you own or rent? You know, whose name is on the lease? How old are you? You're building up that background so the judge is knowing just a little bit about the senior. When you get to those next questions, that is the what, the when, the where. You're talking about that incident. You're painting that picture. So what did the defendant do to you? What hand did they use? What part of your body did they touch? When did this happen? What part of the house did it happen? What did they say? How did they look? Now, one question on here I do have bold, and it is, how did this incident make you feel? Now, I want to juxtapose 2 stories here. I want to talk with one client that we have, and she was abused by her daughter. And later that evening, she was in bed, and she said she woke up and there was her daughter looking as angry as she's ever seen any other human being, not just her daughter, any other human being looked, as her daughter was trying to get this phone from her. And she said she was laying flat on her back and she closed her eyes and said, God, if this is how I'm going to go, then I'm ready. You want to get that in front of the judge because you can almost feel her fear. And one of the challenges, as Leah talked about after the wheel, was unable to physically run. This is one of the challenges that she was suffering from because she was immobile and she had problems with mobility. So she couldn't run. She's laying flat on her back, defenseless, and in deathly fear because she had just been assaulted. You want to get her to paint that story, and you juxtapose that to Mr. Jones, who, he was a tough guy. He was from, what we say, the old school, the older generation, and he had a very hard time when I would ask him this question before, well, how did it make you feel? He would not say that he was afraid in the beginning. And then there was one day when Tara and I were talking to him, he broke down to where we had other attorneys coming out to see if everything was okay. And after he got that pressure off of him, He then was saying he was afraid of what the police would do to his son. He was afraid of what his son would do to him, and he was afraid of what he could do to his son. And when we talked about that in court, how did that make you feel? He then talked about his fear. So it's made it somewhat harder to get them to come to that fear, because they do perceive, saying that they are afraid of their son or whoever, they perceive it as being weak. And that's not the case at all, because the judge needs to hear that. It goes directly to an element of the statute. Next slide, please. So we talk about preparing the seniors for a PFA case. Now, as Tara talked earlier, it is the client who is responsible, and I believe as well, is they are responsible for the service. So what I will do, I will work with the clients. I'll always instruct them for them not to have a confrontation with the adverse party. Get the police, or I try to use other, agencies, whether it's the warrant unit or the sheriff's department, to try and get that affidavit served. Because if the affidavit of service, if there is no service in the case, then after a couple of times, a judge will dismiss it for lack of prosecution. And then they will have to go through the steps of refiling, go through the whole story and all the process again. So then we see, can your client come to court? Now, in the pandemic, our clients were not coming to court, there were virtual hearings, but now we're back in court. But for seniors who are having severe mobility issues, and certainly 90 or above, whatever, I will ask the court if we can make some accommodation for the senior to appear virtually. Some judges have been accommodating to that. When we're appearing in person, I will let them know. Now, I know your subpoena says 9 a.m., but it could be into the afternoon. So when I ask them and let them know, you might want to bring your medication if you're on any. If you need to drink water, let me know. I can bring a bottle of water for you. I want to make them as comfortable as possible while they wait for their hearing to begin. And then I also prepare them what could happen in court, the various scenarios. The defendant might not show up. It could be a default, certainly it could be a full hearing. We could come to an agreement. I give them the whole scenarios of what could happen. And I also tell them there's a chance that it could be continued. And again, keeping in mind the sundowning effect, as if the hearing goes later in the afternoon. Next slide.
So we're running a little short on time. Yeah. So let's look at any questions in the chat. While you're looking at the chat, so this is really, as we talk about the iceberg, our work is sort of the tip of the iceberg of what we're seeing, right? So we do a lot of work with the financial exploitation. When before I came to Senior Law Center, I had never represented a senior in a PFA. And so there are things that are very unique to seniors. And so that's what that previous slide was slightly about, right? In Philadelphia, it's a whole nother animal. I worked in the counties, and maybe there were 20 PFAs on the list. In Philadelphia, there are 50 cases probably in the morning and probably another 25 in the afternoon. And you can't get through those, really. You really can't get through those. And it's really, the whole system is sort of traumatic to a senior. It's traumatic to anyone going through that, but a senior who needs medication or on oxygen or some other things that are going on. And so there's a lot more preparation that you need for a senior and working with their case.
Hey, Leah. So we do have a question/statement from somebody in the chat. Right. And I did see your response. I emailed it actually to myself so Leah could address it.
Sure. Do you want to read it, or is it long?
It's pretty long. I can try to read it. I didn't know if you wanted to go through the read.
It's going to be hard for me to stop this screen share.
Okay.
Question.
Yeah, I'll try to read it. I'll read it quickly. Anna says that she's an elder victim mobile therapist in Montgomery County. I'm currently working with an elderly female client who called police for sexual assault by her spouse of 6 years. She got a PFA and spouse was removed from marital residence, but local police state the DA did not feel case was strong enough to move forward with criminal charges. I referred client to local DB agency who spoke with local police, state she must speak with local police again for DA to reconsider. Does she have any options to pursue sexual assault charges against spouse? She is in the process of She is in the process of reviewing case with Lucy, one of our colleagues at Senior Law Center. The spouse filed for divorce, but client is intent on filing for criminal charges. I don't want to give her false expectations. I understand that. And I feel it's very important that I and others believe her. She has no minimal evidence of sexual assault, but did tell 2 people this had been questioned by the police. Please send any ideas to Anna's email. And I have your email, Anna.
Right. So as we know, with any type of sexual assault, right, it is hard to prove in court, and the criminal standard it's much higher, right? From a senior law center standpoint, we can certainly interview the witness and advocate for the DA to file charges, right? Oftentimes, right, the DAs they have so many cases that they want to find one that has clear shot of winning, and that's not always the case. But sometimes you just need to spend more time with the senior, right? So we can try to advocate with the DA's office in that county to spend the additional time with the senior to say, okay, well, we can make the charges, support the charges because of X, Y, and Z, right? But they are difficult, but we do a lot of advocacy with the criminal sense to try to help them. Any other questions? Because we're running out of time.
No other questions. Let me just check chat. Oh, we do have Bill from Cary in our session, and he is also one of my resources from Cary. Hi, Bill. And I believe, and I apologize if I pronounce your name wrong, Aneska Velasquez. In regards to the trauma iceberg, yes, I did have my trainings at Lakeside Global Institute years ago. Yep, that's where I got the trauma iceberg from.
Well, again, Lamont and Tara did a great job presenting part of our work. Thank you so much for participating. Let me see. We have our contact information here, and then we'll try to make this slideshow available for anyone. Again, we're not necessarily experts, but we're saying we do this work all the time, so there may be some ideas that we have that because you're doing so many other things you might not think of. So please feel free to reach out at any time if you have questions.
Yep, Lee, I was going to say the same thing. And if it's easier, everybody, they can just send their emails to me and I can,
Right.
forward them to you and Lamont if it's easier, because I know you guys are extremely busy. So please don't hesitate to email or call me. That was. Somebody asked, where can they get the PowerPoint slides from, Leah?
Yeah, so we're going to try to make that available. We'll talk with the host and see what we can do about making them available to the attendees.
I think it was just the one last slide that said, thank you. Thank you so much for having us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.